have Shashi Buluswar here, who's a good friend of mine from Lawrence Berkeley National Labs. He runs LIGHT, and I can't remember what that stands for, but the L is for LBNL, and the rest is for...
The T is for technology.
Yeah, and the I is for international, and G is global, maybe? I don't know. Good stuff. So anyway, I wanted Shashi to come here because I think out of like all the people I've seen talk about development technology, he has taken one of the most pragmatic approaches to really think about, from a quantitative way, what would success look like for development technology interventions. So I'll hand it over to you, and please, be open to ask questions and talk throughout this whole thing, right?
Great. And we have
Till 2:30. Yep.
So let's start with.
Oh yeah, can you wear the mic? Yeah, they're not great.
Very good.
Is that visible enough, or do you guys like the dark?
So let's start with a very easy question. If you wanna improve the statistics on maternal mortality and neonatal mortality and childhood mortality, what are you going to build? Yeah.
I think knowledge about how better deal with the problems.
Okay. And technology-wise, what would you build?
So one of the main causes for child mortality is diarrhea,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the best, like, there was a research here that was conducted which showed just putting chlorine tablets
Yeah.
to
Yep.
taps,
Yep.
and then also slightly educating them about using it. So an easy to adopt system
Yep.
can have huge results without too much cost.
Anyone else? Good answer. So if I were to take a poll and say, if you had to choose a technology today, by the end of the day, what would you choose? Each of you. Let's take a couple more answers. Yes.
Just any water purification technology.
Anyone else? Yeah.
Like mother's health. Mother's health.
Yeah, but what means? So say more about that.
So like free care while the child is still in the womb. There are different things
Yep.
that I think you can do that
Yep.
affect how healthy the child is when they're born.
Yep.
Diet, food.
Yep. Very good. So you're all right, but what we'll see is that in this space and in this particular problem, it is very much that example of the proverb around the six blind people touching an elephant, because there are plenty of correct answers, but there are very few complete answers, and complete not just with respect to technology, but the broader problem. And just to give you a sense of why, the context of why we have to think about it this way. So our institute, sort of like the Tata Center here, we were created a couple of years back, 2012, and the idea was the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, all this brain power like here, how can you put that to work and solve problems in developing countries? And one of the more frequently cited problems is mother and child health, which includes maternal mortality and neonatal mortality and a host of things up to the age of 5. And the first thing we started doing was just asking people this question: what should we build? What should we build? And we got, honestly, a lot of the same answers, right? And somehow they did not seem intellectually satisfying, because there seemed to be something missing. And so what we had to do was really look well beyond what the NGOs said, what the clinicians said, what the technologists said. And what I'd like to do today is have a conversation with you guys about if we were to build a technology-enabled service, because you'll see that it's not just technology, it's a lot more than that. You mentioned training, right? So human capital is a very important component of this. The problem to avoid is build it and hope they will come, which is what we do as technologists very, very well. So and stop me anytime. This is not a lecture, it's a conversation. And what I'd like to do is look at the clinical aspects of this, the policy, the social aspects of this, and sort of the deployment challenges involved, and then share an example of how we're thinking of it in terms of an actual project we're doing. And by no means have we nailed it, but the idea is to just talk through the pros and cons of various ways of thinking about this problem. Right, so the project is called the Universal Clinics Project, which doesn't sound very ambitious. So let's look at maternal mortality. So if you ask a clinician, here's what you'll get. Now, what causes, until recently, the number used to be 360,000. There was a downward revision. I don't know if it's because the numbers actually went down or whether the sampling methodology changed, but one day it was 255,000, not 360,000. Still, it's, give or take 1,000 women a day dying during childbirth. If you ask a doctor, here are the answers you'll get. It's between 25%, and different people draw this pie differently. Postpartum hemorrhage, which means that women bleed to death. And there are a number of complications that cause that as well. And then you have hypertension, and so on, the list goes on. But the truth is, it's a small number of conditions that lead to maternal mortality. You solve for these 3 or 4 things, you've sort of solved the problem and reduced the mortality number to a level where it's not one of the more significant problems in global health. Right? So again, just from if you were talking to a clinician, then you say, well, what causes PPH? What causes hypertension? Here's what you get, right? So, well, it turns out that, again, these numbers are a little suspect because I don't think we have enough statistics, but if the WHO had actually put these things out, so about half the cases, it's because of this condition called uterine atony, which basically means that the uterine muscle doesn't contract. Very simple, and so the bleeding isn't stopping. Right? And after that, it's a whole, the reasons start fragmenting. There are many more. And then as you look through the list, hypertension is these 2 clinical conditions called eclampsia, preeclampsia. It's not clear what causes those, right? And infections, again, infections typically, it's about the sanitary conditions. Indirect causes are HIV, malaria, and so on and so forth. And there's one big issue around unsafe abortions where there are severe restrictions on abortions, right? So what do you do with this? So you talk to a bunch of doctors, whether they're in Kenya or Bangladesh, India, and this is the answer you get, right? So what do you do with this information? So far, is this helpful to you guys? No, right? If you're a clinician, it's helpful, but to solve the problem, it's not, right? And so now, so this is, remember, just maternal, right? Let's look at neonatal. Same thing, right? So there's this whole big slice of the pie called preterm birth complications. And what has the technologists' answer to this been? There are actual real examples. Can you think of an example in the technology for development space where, seemingly, if you believe the media story, that problem's been solved?
Incubators?
Specifically, what in incubators?
Like newer ones, or just 4 of them given away?
Yeah.
C-sections? With incubators, you have Firefly, Grace.
Yeah, I mean, so specifically, that's what I'm talking about, right? Which is C-sections. That's a more complicated set of conversations around the appropriate way to do delivery. Not being a physician, I'll sort of stay away from that, right? Also recognizing that the level of care you need, both in terms of the technical training and the facilities, C-sections is a whole different level of sophistication. So yeah, so there are technologies, and no need to name any, but infant warmers, phototherapy devices. And if you actually listen to the narrative, you'd think that the problem's been solved, right? Yes, prematurity is a fairly big problem, but it's a whole host of things. The point is that you have an infant that's not ready for life yet. And whether it's hypothermia, whether it's infections, whether it's respiratory distress, there are a whole bunch of these things that happen, and one technology is not going to fix that, right? So let's just assume that, let's take these 2 things, right? Infection and again, the babies in general can't fight off infections. When they come out, when they're not ready, their vulnerability is that much higher, right? So infections and warmth. right? So let's unpack where the technology for development solution falls apart. And this is important because you guys want to build technology, right? So this wonderful technology came out of Stanford, Embrace. It's an infant warmer. And the idea is that when the infant is born, it needs to be in a warm place because hypothermia is one of the biggest killers, right? So how would you use it? So Embrace it looks like a little cocoon. It's got a couple of different types of warming technologies. One uses phase change material. I'm not sure what the other uses, but essentially it's this warming thing, right? So it's a wonderful product and a lot of people like it. But so you've got this fabric-y thing. Under what circumstances is it helpful versus not helpful? I recognize none of you has actually delivered a baby. Yeah. Yes?
Probably needs electricity, so you need to be somewhere close to
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Now, I won't answer this question yet. We'll come back to why this is an extraordinarily important question to answer. But one of the other things is if you've got this big cocoon, even from a clinical point of view, right? Where do the bacteria hang out? In the nooks and crannies and crevices, right? So if you've got this fabric-y thing, even if it's made of tent material or whatever, babies they're just sort of petri dishes for pathogens, right? And so if you have this thing, you take that baby out, you put it on the baby, and what's going to happen? Unless you really extensively cleanse it. And as you can guess, in a lot of these contexts, cleaning it and sterilizing it is not that easy, right? So just even from that very basic point of view, it's one thing to have a technology come out of a classroom. It's an entirely different thing to figure out the millions of complications that you run into in deploying it, clinical, let alone business and market demand and so on. Right? Now, very quickly, let's just look at under 5 childhood mortality. And some of this actually overlaps with the previous page on neonatal conditions. So what's one big thing you see between in South Asia versus Sub-Saharan Africa? What's the one big difference? So diarrheal disease is common to both. Someone mentioned that a couple times. It's absolutely correct. What else? Malaria. So that's one big difference, right? And anyone know why? So it turns out that malaria is caused by a particular parasite, Plasmodium, and the strain of the parasite in Sub-Saharan Africa, Plasmodium falciparum, is the one that's a killer. In South Asia, where you have a lot of malaria, you can get malaria and you'll feel sick and you'll be fine, right? It's Plasmodium vivax, which is a different pathogen, a different parasite. Now, as it happens, falciparum is actually growing in South Asia as well, but that's the big reason, is that it's just the mosquitoes are there, they still bite, and it's still annoying as heck, but they just don't carry that particular parasite. Right, so we've looked at all the clinical stuff, and honestly, from a technologist's point of view, that's not very interesting, right? It's good information, but you can't really do anything about it. Now let's add the social dimension to it. Oh, let me ask you a question before that. If I were to ask you, what is the public expenditure on healthcare per capita per year in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa? If you had to pick a number, what would that number be? Pick a number. You can pick a number. You're at MIT. Doesn't have to be correct.
I don't know what their income is, but I would say it would be maybe 20%, 10% of their income.
No, dollars-wise per year.
$100, $50.
Very good. Actually, see? So it turns out that you're very accurate, which is in South Asia, it's $53 per person per year. In Sub-Saharan Africa, it's 95. See? Never be afraid to guess. And honestly, the reason it's higher in Sub-Saharan Africa is only because of the recent influx of aid money for HIV, and mostly HIV, but to some extent malaria as well, right? But it's nothing. It is nothing. It's a very nice pizza, right? And or in Boston, it's mediocre. Sorry. But I mean, and most of that actually goes into the ministries, because the health ministers and the whole bureaucracy and the buildings, they all cost money, right? And that goes into this. And so very, 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 very pennies, a couple bucks a year, trickle down into actual healthcare delivery. And again, the reason this is important is that the context is extremely essential to figuring out what you're going to do with the technology. So the other thing to realize is that since the Millennium Development Goals were announced, there's a lot of funding in health, but it all went to the big infectious diseases, right? HIV, malaria, TB in particular. Some went into vaccines for a number of things. There was a lot of attention on diarrheal disease, but the thing that got ignored was infrastructure development. No clinics, no clinicians. You mentioned human capital and training, right? None. What we'll see, for instance, is one way to measure the healthcare infrastructure is that the number of beds, and we'll define beds in just a second, right? We'll look at a picture of a bed. So independent of what that bed looks like, it is a tiny fraction. It's 0.6 per 1,000 people. Okay. And it's called, I very carefully call this healthcare bed, not hospital bed, because hospital, it has to be at a particular level of operation to actually be called a hospital. So this is the infrastructure. Let's look at the clinicians. And the reason this is important, I'll tell you in a second, is sub-Saharan Africa per 1,000 people, 0.2, doctors, nurses, 0.8, and that statistic to the right is extraordinarily important, which is the number of births that occur at home versus in a clinic. Right? Now, according to, so it's attended by skilled health staff. Typically, what that means is home versus clinic. Right? So what it means is that more than half the births in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa are being administered by someone who's not trained in it. Okay? They are called traditional birth attendants, and we'll look at the significance of that in just 1 second. Right, so now go back to the pie charts we saw earlier about sepsis and PPH and so on. A more relevant way of looking at mortality is this, right? Which is to say, well, fine, this is important, but where are these births occurring, and where are the fatalities occurring? So this is something we had to compute. I don't think this is ever going to be published, this set of statistics, because nobody knows the answers, right? So the best we can do is take a reasonable sample and interview a bunch of people and basically say, what is your, over the last 5 years, how many women have died at childbirth, right? So I would not call this statistically meaningful, but it's, in the absence of data, in the absolute absence of data, at some point you have to be able to take a good enough guess to, we'll make a decision based on this. But logically, it makes a lot of sense, right? Which is that if you divide births into these types of contexts, which is it at home? Is it at home with the TBA, traditional birth attendant? Or is it at home with a skilled birth attendant? And skilled typically means at least to the midwife level, nurse midwife. Or is it at a health facility? Health facility also defined along particular parameters. A mere building, the existence of a building that's called a clinic doesn't mean that it's an adequate place for people to give birth, right? And so is it equipped, is it not equipped? So after sampling a bunch, our very strong conclusion, which nobody disagrees with, so the funny thing, and this is where our space is so dysfunctional, right? If we publish this, 7 out of 10 experts would tear it down. How do you know it's 65%? But if you ask these same people, what would you guess? They'd say 65%, right? So it's a very good guess, but it's a guess. And so, so the problem we're solving for is this, which is that this is where people are dying. So it's not about an infant warmer. It's not about a phototherapy device, because the births are occurring at home. And if you observe one of these births, what do you think technology looks like to these traditional birth attendants? What technology do they use? Yeah?
Cell phone?
No, it's razor blade, string, and hot water. That's it. That's the only thing they have. Maybe some bandages. Right? Now, we can build a $200 infant warmer. What would they possibly do? I mean, they earn $10 for a birth, right? So what could they possibly do with a $200 infant formula? And remember that this $200 infant formula is, dramatically, so it's often called an incubator. It's not an incubator because an incubator has many other things going on, oxygen and light and so on and so forth. But even if you built a $300 one incubator that does all of these things, that was solar powered and all that on wheels, what could they do with it? Nothing, right? Because they literally go with these bags. Often they walk, depending on where they are, they take a bus. And nowadays, yes, cell phones help a lot. And it is dramatically improving communication. But what could you do with it? I mean, a cell phone's great for talking and saying, I'll come. If your water is broken, I'm going to come. Or, if you feel, I'll come tomorrow and we'll figure stuff out. But that's it, right? I mean, what could you possibly get on a cell phone that could help you deliver a baby? It's not like, I guess you can watch a YouTube video, but chances are you've delivered a baby if you're a TBA already, right? My point is this a technology problem? Yeah.
I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
These deaths, are they maternal deaths?
These are maternal deaths. These are maternal. So as it happens, neonatal statistics look almost exactly the same with respect to percentage distribution. It's a little more complicated, but by and large, it happens because of the lack of infrastructure. Yeah.
I just wanted to also understand, what is the percentage here mean?
Oh, sorry. So in principle, it should add up to more or less 100% with some ranges. Right. So basically, yeah, in the row, okay. Right? So if you take postpartum hemorrhage, in principle, yeah, ranges, yeah.
Do you think there's any variation due to the diagnostic ability? The person is trying to tell what the cause of death was. So
Great.
Will they be able to actually detect if it's PPH or it's hypertensive or it's...
Well, so let's examine what these things are, right? So PPH, basically, you're bleeding. I mean, there's no. It is a sheer volume of blood that you're losing. And if you're suffering from anemia, I mean, it's just the loss of blood that kills you, and the body goes into shock, right? So there is in many ways, there's no need for diagnosis, because it's a fairly obvious condition. The other thing is, even here, there is no indicator. There's no prior indicator of PPH. So even here, with all the technology we have here, it is impossible to predict which woman will have PPH and which won't. So what they do is, physicians, what they do is they use a couple of drugs. One is called oxytocin. Oxytocin, it's called a uterotonic. Essentially, it clots the blood, right? And so a lot of people say, why not use oxytocin? It requires refrigeration. Again, great that if you can, we can build a $50 fridge, right? But how will it's not like the word these TBAs ever heard of a uterotonic or the word oxytocin. What they're familiar with is sometimes people die. Families accept it. Yeah.
So, quick question
Yep.
and a comment. I noticed that on the first line, PPH, there's a high percentage of PPH deaths in equipped clinics.
Yeah.
Does that mean that there's some determination of risk and high-risk people are going to the equipped clinics?
No. It's just so what happens is, so that's the second drug I was talking about, right? So it turns out there's another drug called misoprostol, right? And misoprostol, and again, the policy context is extraordinarily important for this, right? It works remarkably well as oxytocin in every clinical trial. But misoprostol is also used as sort of it's used for medical abortion. Right? I don't know if it's the actual morning after pill, but it's used for abortion. In fact, that's how it was released into the market. But turns out it has these really remarkable properties that stops PPH. Now you can imagine why we're in countries where there are restrictive abortion laws, and these are pills. And because they're pills, they don't require, they'll be fine in 100C, they'll be fine in 0C, right? It does not change how they function at all. And they're not very hard to administer. Right? And now they're starting to become available. But they weren't until recently. Second, even if they are available in the capital city, a lot of these deaths are occurring in rural areas. Even though it's a relatively large number, it's actually, when you think about it, in a village, it might be 3 women a year, right? And what that leads people to conclude is just they accept stuff. Sometimes people die. I mean, again, if you watch movies, right? Used to be in the movies in the 60s and 50s, if you're an old movie buff, there was a lot more of this where for no apparent, no explained reason, the woman giving birth died. You don't see that as much in movies these days, right? Because it was accepted then, it's not, it was considered part of the course of things. It is no longer. And so, my broader point is this, so if we're trying to solve for this extraordinarily important, extraordinarily specific problem of maternal mortality, where the clinical conditions are very well understood, ditto for neonatal mortality and for childhood mortality, there is no technology in the world that is a silver bullet. Now, you can develop some vaccines for some diseases. That's different. Vaccines are amazing for diseases that kill people. So if there were a malaria vaccine, that'd be amazing. Right? And the reason that is powerful is that for vaccine distribution, there is now a distribution infrastructure. Right? There is virtually every ministry actually has these vaccination campaigns, and you just have to do it a few times or once, which is very different from something you have to keep distributing regularly. So even if misoprostol is available, outside of, when you have these women who've, and their entire universe is their cluster of villages. Some of them do not have, sure, there's some Coca-Cola coming in, but it's not like there's a specific and consistent and regular, reliable distribution infrastructure that brings in these things, right?
Shashi.
Yeah.
The abortion at 9% and infection at 8%.
Yeah.
That's 9 and 8% of total deaths.
Oh, correct. Sorry. So this should correlate to this should be from the
pie chart.
Yeah, from the pie chart. Yeah.
So as far as absolute numbers
Yeah.
of deaths, I'm having a little trouble thinking about like how that correlates to all the percentages here.
Yeah.
Because it still looks like PPH probably, in the TBA
Yeah.
births is the highest in numbers.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
But do you think infection is kind of the
Yeah.
area that needs more attention?
So if PPH were solved,
Yeah.
the world would consider this problem solved.
So is your point that like PPH is so hard to predict because it's so hard to solve? It's just going to happen.
Yep.
But infection is very preventable.
Yeah.
That's kind of where the focus should be.
Well, no. My point is that this is a systemic problem. The fact that women give birth at home, that there are no clinics to go to, there are no clinicians to go to, right? And so getting women into clinics is extraordinarily important, not just for maternal mortality, but also because you get good antenatal care, which reduces the likelihood of low birth weight infants and preterm infants, and just substantial. So WHO recommends that a woman have 4 antenatal visits, 4 visits from the moment she finds out she's pregnant to when she gives birth. Here, obviously, we go. My wife goes. Right, she went probably every other day. But point is, it's covered by insurance, right? But 4 is WHO considers 4 to be the minimum number. And there's a good reason to believe that. So take anemia, which is one of the most significant types of malnutrition. And when you're anemic, you're more likely to pass away from PPH, right? You can take iron supplements, right? It's not difficult to diagnose anemia, number one. Number two, if there's a very high incidence of anemia anyway, why bother detecting? Iron supplements never hurt anyone, right? A reasonable amount anyway. So my point is that the paradigm has to shift from giving birth at home, not knowing when you're due, relying on these women who, bless their souls, that's the only resource these communities have. But that is not an acceptable way of giving birth in this day and age. It has to shift from that to a clinic with reasonable equipment. And that's where technology can play a massive role, but we'll see why it's still, even if it's necessary, it's not sufficient. Yes?
So a lot of times when we're talking about solutions, we talk about how it's really difficult to change behavior and
Yeah,
you can
absolutely.
integrate technology
Yep.
into the current context
Yep.
and the current behavior. That's ideal. And so
Yep.
how do you know that the solution should be changing behavior as opposed to finding technologies that will make the home births more successful?
Great question. May I answer that in just 2 minutes, because we'll get to that. Yes. Yes.
Can you comment on the timing when it's most critical to administer a solution? Are these deaths occurring
At birth.
At birth.
At birth.
Not a few days later, or
No. It's at birth. So yes, pretty much.
So
Yep.
the solution would happen right when
Yeah.
that
So 24 hours around when here. Yeah.
I'm sorry, what are those percentages of? So like for the indirect column, they don't add up.
Oh yeah, so if they don't add up, that's just because I haven't done the, but they should be close enough to adding up, right? So there should be about 100% if you range it.
So those are like the percentages of those types of rates?
Yeah, so if you take PPH, right, which is the most significant, essentially 2/3 to 3/4 of them happen when TBAs are administering the birth at home. Some of them happen when there's a slightly more skilled. So one of the phenomena is that these women get training as midwives or something. They go back and they still do this for a living, but it's at home. So they still don't have equipment. They have slightly better training. So there's this thing that we'll see in a second. It's called AMSTL, Active Management of AMTSL, third stage of labor. That is that is probably the single most important skill that midwives and nurses learn in delivery. And that if they learn that, even if they're delivering at home, it reduces the chances of some of these things. More importantly, when it comes to PPH, they're able to. There are some basic technologies they can use, and not even technologies that usually they know to take with them, whether it's misoprostol, whether it's like a tamponade or something, and so they're able to intervene in the immediate aftermath of something like PPH. Yes and no. I mean, this is, yeah.
Columns that are two
Yep.
that are anomalous. The first row and the bottom row, they don't agree with each other. The PH row and infection row disagree on the health facility.
Yeah, so good point, right? So the thing with the health facility is you'll see some pictures of a health facility. I'm sure you've actually been to some of these things, right? Infection is, if you're in an unsanitary place, you pick up infections. And often, who goes to health facilities? Sick people, right? So again, I want to stress that we'd never be able to publish this, but logically and from what we've heard, we concluded that for something like PPH, chances are a clinic has more stuff, but if it's a rudimentary clinic, it also has more pathogens in it. Okay? So the broader question is this: how do you get people to clinics, and what does a clinic mean, and what are the economics of building a clinic, right? Because unless you solve that problem more broadly, you're not going to solve maternal mortality, because again, you take this perfect phototherapy device, you take this perfect infant warmer. If the problem is that people are giving birth at home, having that exist in a vacuum is not going to make a difference, because even so, the way often the metric for success for a lot of these devices is how many people are using it, right? So even if people are clinics are buying it, clinicians are buying it, chances are they are from here. Right? They're willing to try new technologies if it's affordable. And it's not actually reducing mortality. It's not solving the health problem. So even if the fact that usage is going up, and again, I've not cared or bothered to do the studies to see whether these particular devices are having the impact. But again, logic would suggest that if it's these TBAs don't make enough money to buy the stuff. And if they make enough money to buy the stuff, what should they buy, given the 15, 20 things out there, and what can they possibly haul with them, especially if they're traveling on foot or by bus? Yeah. So I won't walk you through the details on this, but the point is there are some very condition-specific things, and there's some very systemic things, and we talked about both of those things. And so it's very important to understand what is addressable unto itself in isolation, and what is structural. Another way of saying that is this, right, which is, again, I spent too many years at McKinsey. I actually believe that this is an exact science. But here's what we did, right? So what we did was went to actual clinicians and say, look, we know there isn't enough data, enough structured data to do an RCT. But if we were to give you 100 points to distribute over, if you needed to fix this, right? You mentioned behavior change. You mentioned behavior change. You mentioned training, right? All of those are true. So there's policy, infrastructure, human capital, behavior change, access to finance, and technology. It's very important to know where would you place your bets. So if, again, you take 100 points, distribute them over these levers, so to speak, and if 80 out of 100 experts are saying, look, this is a training issue, This is a behavior change issue. Why would you bother spending money on technology? Right? But we unfortunately operate in a hammer looking for a nail world. And so we build these things. And I'm not a physician. I play one on TV. But it's not clear to me that these devices actually will make a difference to mortality, even unto themselves, right? Even if they're perfectly functioning devices. Right? And again, I don't want to go into the whole, have you talked about kangaroo mother care and all? Has that come up at all? Right? So one of the this space is replete with all sorts of opinion-based debates, right? So one of those is that skin-to-skin contact is a better way of providing warmth to the baby than an external warmer, right? Is it true? Is it not true? I don't know. Honestly, the studies are inconclusive. One way to think about this is, if you're in the States and your child were suffering from hypothermia, and by the way, it turns out that a baby born prematurely, at a particular, the most common stage of prematurity, they're vulnerable to hypothermia for the first 7 to 10 days of their life, right? So if a baby was born here prematurely and there was a risk of hypothermia, and you were to tell the parents, sorry, the only thing you should do is skin-to-skin care, which means the only thing you get to do to save your baby's child is hold the child, would we find that acceptable? No, right? We'd want actual technology to save our babies' lives. So my point is that debate is going on. It's very important to recognize that, but also take opinions with a grain of salt in terms of, in terms of what intervention is most effective, because there honestly isn't enough data. And even though there are all these randomized control trials for some of these things, truth is they're neither randomized nor really controlled. They're called RCTs, but it's incredibly hard to control for all of these very complicated factors, right? And so a lot of them, I think, and not being a statistician or an economist, I'm sure I'll lose a debate with statisticians and economists on this. But